Okay, thanks everyone for joining this webinar today. I'm going to get started. I think there's still people trickling in as we speak, but we can get started already. So today's is the second Cambridge Zero Research Symposium on health and society is our theme for today. Apologies, and we've got a good program of speakers lined up for you today. So the first speaker for today will be Professor Brayne from the Institute of Public Health. We'll be speaking on population health and sustainability, relationships and opportunities. The second speaker will be Dr. Anna Barford from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, who will be speaking on peak youth, climate change and the role of young people in adapting their futures, views from Uganda. Third speaker is Dr. Emma Garnett, also from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, speaking on the stakes are high, what approaches work to increase vegetarian sales and reduce meat consumption. Then we'll have Dr. Lee De-Wit from the Department of Psychology speaking on, oh, apologies, Lee, I've got Emma's title there twice. That is completely wrong, of course. But Lee will be speaking on his work about a survey in, I need to find the title here, apologies for this, on international public support for government action and policy solutions at COP26, results from a YouGov survey across 7 countries, and I will amend that, sorry Lee. Then the next speakers will be Dr. James Smith and Adam Twigg, speaking about understanding opportunities for improving asthma care while reducing its carbon footprint, review of variation in local guidance. Nelson will be speaking on the role of society and accelerating net zero transition. Christina Xiao will be speaking on push and or pull, a systematic review of studies evaluating the effectiveness of carrot stick and combined population level interventions on modifying travel behaviour. And finally, we have 3 speakers, William, Moody, Ellie Fox and Emma Clarke from the CUSPI Science Policy Challenges, speaking about using youth community-based resources to tackle the climate emergency within Cambridgeshire communities. So just for everyone here, for all the attendees, here are a few rules about how the Q&A works. So you can submit your questions to the speakers using the Zoom Q&A function. You can start doing that as and when you want, whilst the speakers are still speaking, but we will keep all the questions till each speaker has finished their presentation. And then I will put the questions to the speakers and then either answer them live, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get through answering all the questions live, or if not, then speakers can continue to answer by giving written answers to questions in the Q&A window. And you can also upvote questions if you want them answered. Click on the upvote button and they'll come to the top of the list. And just to let people know that this session is being recorded and the recording will be shared on our YouTube channel after the session. Also, I would just like to highlight quickly that this is part of a series of research symposia that Cambridge Zero is organising this Lent term. So the first one on zero carbon energy transformation was last week, and the recording of that session is available on our website and on YouTube. And then today we're on health and society. And then the following weeks, we've got 4 more sessions on resources and production, resilient and sustainable futures, transport, cities and infrastructure, and carbon drawdown and climate repair. And you're of course all very welcome to join those as well. And joining instructions can be found on our website at the bottom there. And we will be sharing that link with everyone after today's session. And continuing on after today, so please join us for our next session on Wednesday the 17th of February on resource and production. Please do also join our mailing list. The link will be shared with you as well, and follow us on Twitter as well. So I would like to stop there and hand over to Professor Brayne, who is going to give the first presentation. So Carol, would you like to share your screen, please? I'll stop sharing mine, and then you should be able to share yours.
Okay, so can you see it all right?
Yes, we've got your screen. That's perfect. Over to you.
Great, thanks. And thanks so much for asking me to speak. It's terrific and good to see that so many people are online. I'm really looking forward to the other presentations. Do chip in, Eric, if you can't hear me all right, because I'm working on the computer mic.
We can hear you very well, so that's all great. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so in my short presentation, I really wanted to try to highlight how health at a collective level and sustainability agendas really do align extremely well through observation and personal experience, as well as research. So I think it's really important to always frame our research and our thinking in terms of sustainable development goals, which of course go well beyond Cambridge Zero, the carbon reduction and particular climate goals. They go well beyond that into society. But if we don't get the climate bit right, we're not going to have a human society to implement and try to improve all those things that are going on in society. So I just wanted to highlight Cambridge Public Health, which is a new interdisciplinary cross-university activity. And one of the pillars in research pillars that's been identified for Cambridge Public Health is sustainability. And James Smith is one of the co-leads from that pillar. So just to highlight that as an opportunity for any of you who are interested in the health intersection between, the intersection between health and population health and climate change and sustainability, and do get in touch. So now I'm going to try and make sure that I can, my slides aren't changing and I don't know why. That's really, oh, here we go. There we go. So these issues are not new in terms of the interface between health and sustainability. It's just that the time now is more urgent than it has ever been. But this is a poster from 1970. This is an issue that has been around for a very, very long time. We've just taken a very long time for the crises to accumulate for human societies to really start paying attention. So we have a long tradition, I think, to build on of working on at the intersection of climate and sustainability and health. And I just wanted to give for a moment a public health perspective, which is how our health develops within our contexts. And public health thinks about primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. And primary prevention is the upstream prevention of trying to have a healthy environment, whether it be not being in a smoke environment, having low air pollution or clean water, etc., etc. And the secondary prevention is when you have early detection of diseases that may already have sort of set off on their way, or risk factors which have actually been effectively labelled as diseases now. So you're kind of bringing disease into earlier and earlier and creating an evidence base for things like screening. Screening is the obvious manifestation of secondary prevention. And then tertiary prevention is treatment and mitigation of diseases once present. And that includes, of course, optimal end-of-life care. And the reason why I labour this a bit is because we know that the consequences of actions in primary, secondary and tertiary in terms of sustainability or use of resources are very different for the different types of activity. And you get different bangs for your buck if you want to have an economic model, or you get different outputs for your investment of energy, materials, resources, etc., and capacity from each of those different types of prevention. And that is that's almost the headline of this talk, which is that we need to pay much more attention to this, the balance of these different types of activities when we're trying to optimize the health of populations and also cope with increasing numbers because we are living longer. So each individual sits in their context and our health is not our own personal decision. It is many things. It's how we are constituted, our life courses, and the environment in which we are placed, whether it be psychological, physical, emotional, and structural. There are many influences on how our health plays itself out and our well-being plays itself out. And of course, all of these in turn have their own impact and potential for improving or not improving sustainability of our societies and our species. So just an illustration of primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. I'm going to use something which appears to be outside sustainability, but in fact is probably aligned if we think about having more harmonious societies in which we have better interactions and good intergenerational interactions and more positive well-being and less intergenerational potential for transmission of poor behaviours, as it were, or behaviours that are very distressing. So here, this example is how you might conceptualize primary, secondary and tertiary prevention for domestic violence and violence in the household. And of course, this has very prolonged consequences on individual health. So this is where you prevent violence occurring in the home, actually having more harmonious families and social interactions, and actual specific prevention of individual acts of violence, might be restraining orders, and then handling the mental health and physical outcomes of violence. And really, just to kind of highlight, you can apply this primary, secondary, tertiary prevention to many frameworks, and you can also think about what the implications are for society and therefore for sustainability more generally. So that's one example. I'm going to draw on the work that I've done over the last 35 years to illustrate the interaction between healthy aging and the sustainability agenda. And this is a study of health and well-being in older people, 65 plus, which is population-based, so it's representative of the geographies in which the study was taking place, which is in the UK. And we estimated the prevalence, that's the proportion of people who might have dementia, who have dementia at any given age, in around 1990 and in around 2010. Same geographies, same methodologies. And you can see here, this is for dementia, so you can see here this very dramatic rise in dementia prevalence with age, up to 35% in the earlier study, was in the 1990s. And in the second study in 2010, around 2010, I mean, these are huge endeavors, you can see that it's significantly lower. Now, dementia is something that occurs in older age. It's a really big issue, and I'm sure you've seen lots and lots of publications about it in the media, and heard a lot on radio and TV and on the internet. And it's seen as a tsunami. And because of the aging population, people feel that something must be done. We've shown that there's a drop in prevalence of dementia across generations, almost certainly because of things that were done after the Second World War that have affected the generation that are 65 plus in 2010, as opposed to the generation that was 65 plus in 1990, who had much different, had very different life course experiences through the Second World War, etc. So this shows that the social structure may have a profound influence on individual brain health outcomes. And we know that there's quite a bit profound change in heart disease and stroke as well, which may well be associated with these changes that we see. But there's also been increases in education, better vaccination programs, better nutrition, social net welfare systems, etc., and better healthcare system when people do have disorders. So there is a real sense of the malleability of our health as organisms across generations and between groupings within society. So this is just, we have the empirical evidence that we can change health in a positive way. Now, we've changed that probably in primary prevention manners. So in the way that I've just described the upstream things, rather than the secondary prevention and the tertiary prevention. And in terms of energy and material resource usage, primary prevention is likely to be far more aligned with the sustainability agenda than secondary and tertiary prevention. And here in this slide, there's just a list of the world's sort of top 12 dementia risk factors for which we might be able to do something. And if you look at these, physical inactivity, head injury, less education, hypertension, diabetes, depression, hearing impairment, obesity, infrequent social contact, air pollution, excessive consumption, I'm sure you can all see how you can align a positive health agenda for brain health with sustainability development goals. So the way that we structure our society and the way that we organize it can move towards both brain health with aging, as well as healthy aging, as well as better, more sustainable futures. But also in these 12 risk factors here, you can see that there's a really, really stark message about inequalities as well. We can't really address sustainability and health without addressing inequalities, the very strong inequalities that we have in society at the moment. This slide I actually took from the Lancet Commission. So there's been a lot of work on the interface of health and climate change, and the Lancet has had a running commission since 2010, and lots of publications coming out from that. And this is just the 2020 update that's come out. And you can see that the greenhouse gas emissions from the healthcare sector and the healthcare access quality index, there is a kind of relationship there, but a country like the USA has a very, very secondary prevention and tertiary prevention approach to its health promotion, and it has poor health outcomes. Whereas a country like Cuba, which isn't actually noted on here, has a much more primary prevention approach. It does have a lot of health problems, but it's got health metrics which are better than the USA's, with much less energy expenditure and much less per capita expenditure. So that it is possible to organise your healthcare systems in ways that is positive about health of the population and more equitable, and it's possible to do it in ways that are very, very expensive and very, very energy and resource intensive as well. So this slide I took from that Climate Commission as well, just to show that there is a kind of increase in the blue line at the bottom is the publications, newspaper articles on health and climate change, and it is beginning to come up. So I think it is a moment, we're at a moment where we can align these agendas and start to communicate with the public about the positive benefits of both of bringing our actions together for health and climate. This is coming back to the inequalities point, which is if we don't also address the inequalities and the adverse conditions that we have in our societies, then we will have challenges in addressing the climate emergency. We need to have more equal societies, global equity, but also within and across communities. And I'm just highlighting the societal challenges that we have, just to pick up the theme of the intergenerational violence that I picked up earlier on as well. That I don't think we can ignore these big societal kind of elephants in the room. And I'm going to miss that one. And just, this is my last slide. So we really need a population life course approach. It's societal, place, communities, household, individual. See how health can be optimized through activities in each of those, and all of those can be aligned with the climate change and the sustainability agendas, in my view. So primary prevention, I list some of those things there. Primary prevention with multi-sector scrutiny of each element of our lives. So it's education, housing, transport, active travel, employment, shared spaces, nutrition, food, alcohol, fast food. And secondary prevention, we need to really scrutinise what benefit are we doing to whom with early detection and early diagnosis to make sure that we really are benefiting people. So appropriate care and appropriate research targeted to improve health so that we don't waste resources. And tertiary prevention similarly, and thinking about heroic medical interventions, which also are extremely consuming of resources and don't necessarily lead to good end of life, say. So, and finally, the inequalities. If we address all of those things, then we would naturally address the thing on the right, which is a life course trying to reduce risk for poor brain health at the end of life. So we would not only have healthier, older age, healthier brains, but also sustainable societies. So that's me. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you very much, Carol. That was really, really interesting. And thanks for highlighting that really important link between tackling the health agenda and the climate change agenda and how those two interconnect. We've got one question here come up in the Q&A from Charlie, who's saying, great talk, thanks. Is there evidence which links access to the natural world to physical and mental health? If so, should we look to incorporate the natural world into the built environment?
Yes, and absolutely, yes, there is. There's lots and lots of a big body of literature on mental health and access to green spaces and so on. It is, of course, always more complicated, and there is this movement called social prescribing, where GPs can sort of prescribe you to go for a walking group or whatever. Those sorts of things where it's an individually based approach. But I suppose what I would take from the knowledge that we have about the natural environment is that we need to work with those who design the spaces and that we live in to enhance everybody's experience, rather than having kind of social prescribing for individuals or thinking, oh, we must kind of create something there for that group. It's about designing our entire environment in a way that works both for the sustainability agenda, but and for our mental and physical health.
Great, thanks for answering that question. If there's any other people in the audience who would like to ask a question to Carol, please add your questions in the Q&A box now. In the meantime, oh, here's one actually, sorry. Werner is asking, in terms of factors that affect overall population health, how much does income inequality within the population play a role? And should we be targeting this as a key metric to improve health?
I think that's a really interesting question. And my understanding, and this isn't, I'm not a political scientist, so my understanding is that the greater the divide, as it were, if you have people who are on the low salary is sort of like a 200,000 times less than the highest salary, then the metrics for that population will not be great. So the more inequality that we have in a country, the more you can predict that the health metrics won't be as good as they could be. So yeah, I think it's a really important potential health index.
Great, thank you. And here's another question literally just coming in from Hui, asking, this is really interesting. Is there a way to incorporate these interrelations for modeling how we can design built environment better and subsequent energy efficiency improvement?
Yes, there is. I mean, there are researchers around the world who are looking at these kinds of things, but I think there's so much more that could be done here, and I think we probably need to simplify the models and then have a go at the multi-dimensional inputs and do some what ifs. Right.
I mean, that's definitely something that maybe we should be linking up more between the different groups here in Cambridge and trying that kind of stuff.
That would be brilliant. Yeah.
Yes. I had a very quick question myself, where I was really interested in the graph showing greenhouse gas emissions versus the healthcare index, and I was wondering if you know roughly where the UK sits on that kind of plot.
That's a good question. I don't offhand, but I think it's somewhere towards it is a bit further to the left. We're not as bad. We're nothing like as bad as the US.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But it is a huge, our health and social care system, or the analysis that the Sustainable Development Unit of the NHS and Public Health England did, showed that we are very significant greenhouse in terms of the overall greenhouse effect for the country.
Yeah. Yeah.
James might be able to answer that question later.
Yes, maybe we'll come back to that later. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Carol. And I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to move on now to the next speaker. So the next speaker for today is Anna Barford from Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So Anna, over to you, and please share your screen. And Anna will be speaking on peak youth, climate change, and the role of young people in adapting their futures, views from Uganda.
So Eric, can you tell me, can you see that well?
We can't see your screen yet, no.
See your screen yet? Oh.
Oh, here it comes, here it comes. It's just a bit slow.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's not your fault.
In person, you can see it how it should be come across.
It's just coming up, I think. Yes, there we go. Looking good. Over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and also thank you, Carol, for your talk, and thank you, Eric, for organising this. Today, I want to take you from an ageing population in the UK to a very young population in Uganda. And I want to present some work that I'm doing with my colleagues.
Sorry, your slides have just disappeared again. Can you?
Oh, have they?
The resume slideshow button is now showing for everyone.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry, everyone.
Right. It looks like it's come back. If you just click presenting mode, yeah, there we go. We're back. Okay, thanks.
Very good. Okay. So what I'd like to do is talk through some work that I'm doing with colleagues in Uganda, which Anthony Mugari from Makerere University, and also Rachel Prof and Bernard Isiko from Resilience Development, all based in Kampala in Uganda. And I want to present a project that we're doing to try and understand societal vulnerability and also resilience to climate change, particularly at a time when the youth population is very large in Uganda and growing, and in a country which is being affected already by climate change in quite serious ways, but also to see how young people are adapting and trying to being proactive in finding solutions to the challenges they face. So this is a quote from Vanessa Nakate, who is a very active youth climate activist, and she says, climate change is hitting the most vulnerable communities with the least heard voices. The voices of the most affected communities are not given the opportunity to speak louder. And this kind of highlights where we're hoping to bring our project to try and understand how people who aren't necessarily well documented in terms of the experiences that they're having in response to climate change can actually have their voices heard, and also to understand what the solutions that are being developed and where policymakers can help and intervene to be effective. So one such example is this young man, Bosco, whose parents are crop farmers who are able to produce enough to feed the family, but not much more. But the moment that there's food insecurity because of a drought, people in his family and also in his community are going hungry. So it just shows that that point again that Carol was making about how when there is inequality, sometimes it's the people who are poorer and with least resources who are then most vulnerable to those impacts, because they don't have so much resources to be resilient if something does happen. Thinking more widely, the United Nations Environment Programme has highlighted how no continent will be struck as severely by the impacts of climate change as Africa. And there's two maps here which show the expected anomalies in both surface temperature and precipitation just over this kind of 2020 to 2024 period, in contrast to previous 30 years. And it shows that firstly, it's very uneven the way in which these effects are going to take place across the continent. So you can see from the surface temperature map that actually in the kind of North Africa, that's where the highest temperature anomalies are going to be, whereas precipitation, heightened precipitation is going to be more kind of intense in that central belt of Africa, which is where Uganda is located. But these maps tell us something, but they don't necessarily tell us the kind of the day-to-day or the month-to-month variability, which is also affecting people in terms of what they're expecting in terms of weather patterns and how that impacts upon their agricultural activities. It also doesn't tell us that much about the human context onto which that's mapping. So just to give some more information about Uganda, as I already mentioned, it's a very young country. So the median age is 15.8 years old, which makes it the third youngest country, demographically speaking, in the world. That population is set to grow and continue to grow throughout the century. So by the end of the century, there'll be an even larger youth population. It's driven by something called population momentum, where you have a large youth population. So people are of reproductive age. So you've got a large population of reproductive age. It means you get more babies more quickly. So for some countries, this is a moment of great economic growth, but only if young people have got enough jobs and an opportunity to make a living in favourable conditions. One of the challenges that Uganda's facing at the moment is that there's a really high labour underutilisation rate, which means that people aren't able to get the amount of work that they want to do. They can't get the number of hours they want, and they're not doing what might be described as productive jobs. In countries where there isn't such a strong social safety net, the measure of unemployment is less useful than it is in wealthier countries. In wealthier countries, the unemployment rate is much higher because there is actually the option to be unemployed, whereas a poor person with no safety net just still has to work, even if it's very difficult and the work is not well paid. So into this context of kind of people already not having well-paid jobs and enough decent work, then you add this kind of additional precarity of climate change, whereby the weather patterns are not playing out as expected, and there's increases in the amount of flooding and parallel increases in the number of droughts, and seasonality is disrupted, so people can't predict when to plant and when to harvest so easily. This increase in disrupted agriculture has also led to migration. So our study is kind of interested particularly in young people, given this kind of demographic situation in Uganda, and how their livelihoods and their lives are being affected by climate change, and also how they're responding to this. And we're looking at two regions. We're looking at Karamoja region and Jinja. So just to orient everyone, here's Uganda. So it's bordered by South Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the two places we're working are very different. So we're working in Karamoja, which is in the northeast, and it's a very arid area. There's lots of pastoralism. It's quite underserved in terms of infrastructure and government services, and there's kind of still quite a lot of cattle rustling that goes on in that area. And then in the south, we're working in Jinja, which is much more verdant. It's wetter. There's more agriculture in terms of arable agriculture, and it's very close to the capital city Kampala. So it's much better connected. It's got a vibrant tourism trade in normal years, although clearly not so much at the moment. So just after sharing that context, the work of this study, which is still ongoing, has been to document how young people are making a living, and to find out how climate change is intersecting with their lives and their livelihoods, and also to look at what solutions young people are finding to the challenges they're facing. We're doing this through a series of interviews, a survey, and focus groups. And one thing that's really important about this work is that we're using led approach to our research, and this is actually one of the hallmarks of the NGO we're working with, is to do youth-led research. And the vision is to have young people involved at every stage of the research process, in terms of setting the framework, designing the questions that will be asked, both the research questions but also the research tools, so the questionnaire or the interview guide, to have them involved in collecting data, involved in analysing findings, validating those findings, and then also using those findings to bring about change. So working with an NGO, you very much can focus also on impact and what happens to those findings. What's the point of getting that data in the first place, and how can they be used to bring about change? So we've had young people involved throughout our process so far, although we've not got to the stage of sharing final results yet. So what we have observed so far is that young people in both regions were reporting less predictable rainfall, more droughts, but also more floods. and also increased winds and desertification, partly resulting from individuals' activities of tree cutting, but also probably from associated climate change changes. In Cambridgeshire specifically, so remember that was the poorer, more arid regions of the northeast, some of the impacts have been more severe than they have been in Ginger, which was the wealthier area. In particular, and that's particularly because people are less resilient because they've got less. So food shortages and water shortages were more prevalent, particularly in dry seasons. Heavy rains were causing damage to water sources or making them inaccessible, which causes a problem for animals as well as for people. And people were becoming displaced by these effects. And the problem of displacement not only causes problems for those individuals because they're having to build new lives, but also it breaks down a community and it breaks down that potential for mutual support. One thing I've not mentioned is another important finding is how young people, they're very worried about this and it's really impacting upon their mental health in terms of trying to understand what's going on and the huge amount of uncertainty they have about their futures and what their futures might hold, especially in the context that they maybe don't understand the science or the meaning behind climate change in the same way as someone who's maybe been taught about it in more detail. Okay, so how are young people adapting? Some people are shifting completely out of agriculture and they're diversifying within that kind of agricultural value chain. So they're processing foods more or they're selling agricultural products rather than farming them to reduce the risks to themselves. Some are kind of addressing the problem of water management head on. So they're investing in collecting water when it's plentiful so that they've got some for dry periods or maintaining the water sources available. Or moving to farm different land. Often people are kind of taking on multiple different solutions to try and kind of solve this in different ways. But repeatedly we found that finances are limiting the type of resilience or the type of adaptation that are available to individuals. We also asked what support young people would need or what they would want from outside. Whether it's from their government, from NGOs, or something that's more international. And while there were many different things that came up, three of the things that were overlapping were the need for better information on weather patterns and also kind of instruction in how to interpret and make sense of weather forecasts so that they can kind of navigate this change in terrain in an easier, better informed way. There was a request for training in terms of what the alternative livelihood options might be for them to support their adaptation, and also the need for financial support so they could fund the alternative ideas that were coming up. So this isn't, young people are very active, they're very aware, they're very active and very proactive about the issues they're facing. Here's some young Fridays for the Future marchers from Uganda, and also Vanessa Nakate again speaking up for climate justice. But nevertheless, the support of the policymakers and the NGOs around would also benefit people. So my last slide is some recommendations based on our research so far. Firstly, in terms of supporting people with their adaptation to climate change, interventions are first needed to make sure that people can meet their basic needs, and this will enhance resilience more generally to many different shocks that can affect people, including climate change. Young people should be provided with information and training and financial resources to support new livelihood activities. And in particular, more jobs are needed. If there's a large job creation programme which could give young people a solid and dependable source of income, that would reduce vulnerability considerably. People who've been displaced by climate change need particular support to ensure that they can complete their education, secure work in a new location, and help them to build new networks of support to lessen the impact of displacement. It's also really important to engage with the emotional impacts of climate change. we know that young people around the world are worried about the impact of climate change, and other researchers have found that constructive collective actions are a good way to both address the issue itself, but also to reassure people that they can be proactive in response to what can seem like a very large and difficult to address challenge. And lastly, kind of in line with the ethos of our own project, young people should be meaningfully engaged with each step and defining what the problem is in terms of how young people intersect with climate change, where are the challenges, as well as in terms of seeking solutions, how change can be implemented, and also ensuring accountability of the people who are responsible for supporting young people with these challenges. So I'll stop there. Thank you ever so much for listening.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. And I would like to invite any questions from the audience now. Oh, there's my timer going off. You were perfectly on time. And if anyone has any questions, please enter them in the Q&A now, and then we can put them to Anna. I was going to start off with a question myself. So you mentioned how the changing climate and weather patterns and precipitation patterns are affecting the agriculture in the region. So do you think there are, in terms of the adaptation options available, are there also ways that people can adapt the agricultural itself that they're doing? Like, is it possible for them to look at growing different crops that may work in the new climate and things like that? Is that something that people are looking at?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is something that people are looking at. Yeah, I think that's an option. But I think when you're making changes, it's important to have access to the training about, and also the resources for growing those new crops and what they need. It's not something we've found specifically yet, but it's something that's kind of going on more generally.
Right. Cool. Oh, here's a question just come in. Oh, a couple of questions now. A question from St. Catherine's College saying, you mentioned holding those responsible for impact on climate change. Do you have ideas of what this might look like and who this would be? I think holding responsible those who are, I'm not quite sure I get the wording there. But yeah, no,
I think I was I think there's a whole other discussion which is probably beyond the remit of my talk, which talks about who's responsible for climate change. I think looking at the fact that people living in Africa are particularly, not the only ones, of course, but some of the populations that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, despite having such a small responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions, is quite a striking injustice. So I definitely think there's a kind of a wider debate to be had about that. I guess what I was talking about in terms of accountability and how the findings of our study might be used was more thinking about the policy makers at the national level who are responsible for kind of the policies on youth and the policies on climate change, policies on adaptation, to ensure that those structures that are being put in place are actually being implemented correctly and fully, and with the needs of the people who are the intended beneficiaries kind of being well articulated within that process, was what I was trying to get at when I said that.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Charlie asking, or saying, your youth-led approach is great, wonderful work. Your approach sounds linked to the relatively recent Living Lab research concept. Is CISL looking to partner with any Cambridge colleges or organisations looking into similar approaches? So there's a potential there for partnership, maybe.
Yeah, maybe Charlie, you could get in touch with me directly if you'd like to. My CRS ID is AB423. You're welcome to get in touch with me if you want. It sounds interesting, but I've not Living Lab yet.
Sounds like a potential future collaboration there. And I think there's a question here from Carol as well, which has come up in the panelist chat rather than the Q&A, saying limited experience of visiting pair urban areas around Kampala suggests agricultural multi-generational families in which the younger people often brought in the only cash as motorbike taxis, i.e. not one or other and highly familiar. Reforming the pollution produced by the mopeds would mean they lost that cash. Is that something you would want to speak further on?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's a really good point, isn't it? Like a lot of the activities we do are also kind of polluting, and if the way that you're finding work is actually causing more pollution, then I guess ideally there's a route whereby we find some greener jobs. I think the green jobs agenda is really important. Thinking of ways that you can shift away from the more polluting activities towards green activities, while also providing work, I think is really, really, really key. And there's been lots of work by the ILO on the creation of green jobs and creation of circular economy jobs, which suggests that we should be able to really shift in that direction with a net gain of jobs. But I guess what I want to put kind of on the table here is that lack of good jobs is really quite acute in certain contexts, and sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia as well are really kind of struggling with this issue, particularly at the moment. So there's kind of that primary kind of need to make a living and to feed yourself and your family in addition. But I think this point about like what's the kind of ecosystem, the financial ecosystem of the household is really important as well. Like how do a family get by together? Like what are the multiple roles that are going on? And how do they intersect? So that's part of our work, is to kind of map that out in more detail, to understand what's the young person's role within a bigger household in terms of helping everyone get by. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I think with that we'll move on to the next speaker, if that's okay. But thank you very much, Hannah. So the next speaker is Emma Garnett, also from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And so there you go. I can see your slides, Emma, so over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Eric?
Yes, you can, yes. Yeah.
Fantastic. Glad to have sorted that out. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. So as Eric said, like Anna, I'm at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, beginning a fellowship, but I'll be talking today about my PhD research carried out at the Department of Zoology. So the stakes are high. What approaches work to increase vegetarian sales and reduce meat consumption? So the bad news is that producing food has really transformed our planet more than any other human activity. However, the good news is that shifting to a more plant-based diet, particularly in high-income countries, is a very effective approach to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also biodiversity loss. And so this graph on the slide here shows the greenhouse gas emissions for different protein-rich foods. And you can see that there is a lot of variation in each food, particularly beef from a beef herd at the top there. However, it's still the case that the best performing and lowest impact beef, cheese, pork, chicken still tends to have higher greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts than the worst performing tofu, nuts, and other pulses. Another piece of good news is that healthy and sustainable diets overlap to a very large extent. So on this graph, you've got on the y-axis relative environmental impact. So as you go up the graph, foods which are worse for the environment. And then on the x-axis, going from left to right, foods which are more healthy to less healthy. So you can see in the top right corner, you've got unprocessed red meat, that's beef, lamb, and pork, and also processed red meat. Not so good for the planet, not so good for our health in large quantities. And then in the bottom left, you've got vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and nuts, good for you and quite good for the planet as well. There are some important exceptions. So oily fish has a number of different health benefits, but a moderately high environmental impact. Sugar sweetened beverages down at the bottom, no nutritional value besides calories, more or less. But sugar does have quite a low environmental cost. So what does a global sustainable diet look like overall? And there was a report from the Eat Lancet Commission a couple of years ago, and they devised an average global diet that you could flex and move about a bit for 10 billion people, which is a population projection. And in a nutshell, it's a lot of nuts and beans and other vegetables and very little meat, fish and dairy. So they're not saying the whole world has got to become vegan. That's not feasible. It might not be the healthiest diet for many, many people. But per week, how they express it in per week, they recommend about 85 grams of red meat. So that's about 1.5 sausages. And 200 grams of chicken, about 2 portions, and 200 grams of fish. And also 7 glasses of milk, or the equivalent of cheese and yogurt thereof. So over a year, that adds up to about 15.5 kilos of meat per person. And let's call that 17 kilos to account for food waste in household levels. But how much meat do we actually eat in the UK? And the answer is, so in the UK, the average person eats about 81 kilos per year of meat. So that's more than 4 times the recommended sustainable amount. So this graph is showing how meat consumption, that's there on the y-axis, has changed over time from 1961 to 2013 for 6 different countries. So in first place or last, depending on how you look at it, is the USA with 115 kilos per person per year, which is just incredibly high. Brazil and China's meat consumption has skyrocketed over the last few decades. In fact, Brazil has recently overtaken the UK. Nigeria and India continue to have quite low levels of meat consumption, which is much more sustainable. So globally, from 1961 to 2013, meat consumption per person has almost doubled from 23 kilos to 43 kilos. And the global population has more than doubled from 3 billion to 7 billion people. So this means meat production on planet Earth has almost quadrupled in about 50 years. And this simply isn't sustainable. There's not enough land, there's not enough given the climate. So the stakes are incredibly high. And so my PhD research question, like how could we go about changing diets in the UK to less meat? And so this was my study setting, very local, University of Cambridge cafeterias. And I'll talk to you today about 2 different interventions. We looked at order and availability. I'll go into more detail on those. And the outcome we were interested in is what was the percentage of vegetarian and vegan main meals sold out of the total number of meals. And we had sales data from working with some fantastic catering managers and different college cafeterias. We had about 200,000 individual meal selections. So our first set of studies was looking at vegetarian position, like the order that meals are presented in. And we hypothesized you'd get higher vegetarian sales when the vegetarian option was placed first, i.e. nearest the entrance. This is a really commonly held view in a lot of the literature and a lot of pop science as well. But we didn't find really any studies that had tested this with particularly meat and vegetarian options. So we carried out a number of experiments alternating between meat first, that's this little graph on the left-hand side here, this little figure, and veg first, that little figurine in the middle, week by week, swapping between those 2 configurations across the 9-week terms in cafeterias. And as well as the order of the meat and vegetarian options, was it placed nearest the entrance or not, there was also different distances between those options in different cafeterias. So on the left and middle, you've got a short distance, which was about 85 centimeters between the meat and vegetarian options that didn't really have many things in between. So you could see the meat and vegetarian option at the same time. You didn't have to walk to get between one and the other. Whereas in some colleges, the setup was this long distance condition. You can see that on the right hand side. There was well over a meter distance between the meat and vegetarian options because there were various plates and sides and other things in between them. So you'd have to walk to reach that last option. And here are our results. So on the y-axis, so that's vegetarian sales at different meal times as a percentage of total sales. And this meat first condition, when meat was nearest the entrance, is in yellow, and the vegetarian first condition is in blue. And on the left, some of the results under short distance conditions. And the results from this were quite unexpected and quite complicated. So do ask me for more details. And this research is also published. But essentially, under a short distance, we were surprised to find putting the vegetarian option first did not increase sales. And in fact, in some cases, sales were lower, which we were really, really surprised to find. However, under this long distance condition, so this is the graph on the right hand side, when the vegetarian option was placed first, that blue violin plot, sales increased by about 5 percentage points. So a reasonable uplift in sales. However, simply putting the vegetarian option first without thinking through the cafeteria design and the effort it takes to get options is not going to necessarily increase sales. Though a number of university cafeterias have been doing this, putting a vegetarian option first, hoping that that will increase vegetarian sales and decrease meat sales. But our research suggests that this could in fact be counterproductive, and if introduced, this should be trialed to make sure that it is working the way that it was intended to. This study was published last year, and we were really delighted it got some national press coverage. And it was also fantastic. The journalists did really emphasize that the distance between options was really key. It wasn't simply putting a vegetarian option nearest the entrance. I was interested to find the two journalists who did contact me directly were both vegetarians, and so that was why they were interested in the study. And so for the next set of experiments I'll be talking you through, we were really lucky we were able to sort of track individual choices. So diners pay for meals with their university cards, and we'd get anonymized data, and we'd look at using data from a previous term. We'd divide diners into quartiles, so into 4 groups, based on how often they chose vegetarian meals. And statistically, that makes the analysis much more powerful. And so we've got people who are most vegetarian down to more veg, less veg, least veg, based on how often you ate meat or vegetarian meals. And so looking at the availability of vegetarian options, we hypothesized that if more vegetarian options were available, that would increase vegetarian sales. This seemed intuitive and evidence from some other fields looking at healthy diets. And so we run some studies in 2 cafeterias, and they both naturally varied the number of vegetarian and total options served. So for example, this hypothetical menu, on Monday lunchtime, you've got 3 options, 2 of which are vegetarian. So that's 67% vegetarian availability. Popping over to Thursday lunchtime, you've got 4 options, 1 of which is vegetarian. So the vegetarian availability is 25%. An awful lot of percentages in this. I hope it's clear. And here are the results. And we were interested to find that doubling vegetarian availability from 25% to 50%, so from 1 in 4 options to 2 in 4 options, increased vegetarian sales by about 15 percentage points. And so you can see on this graph, again, the y-axis, vegetarian sales as a percentage of total sales. And then on the x-axis, as you move from left to right, the menu is more vegetarian, so proportionally. And we were also relieved to find as well that overall sales remained about constant across the colleges. So it didn't see serving more vegetarian options increase sales and didn't seem to put people off. And because we were able to look at increasing the vegetarian availability, the effects it had on different demographics, and we found that all demographics were more likely to buy vegetarian meals. So from the most veg to the least veg. And in fact, the least vegetarian, the most carnivorous quartile of diners, actually had the strongest response to increasing the vegetarian availability. You can see that sort of steep curve there. Admittedly, they were going from a very low level to a slightly higher level. And also, perhaps slightly surprisingly, even the most vegetarian quartile of students in Cambridge going to cafeterias are also more likely to increase their selection of vegetarian meals. So it's a bit sort of a sort of chicken and egg approach that you might imagine a number of dining establishments might say, oh, well, we don't serve vegan, vegetarian options, not so many of those options because people don't buy them. But actually, in fact, from our research within a British university context, it's like, no, it's the other way around. Actually, if you provide people with tasty, appealing vegetarian and vegan options, they'll be more likely to go for them. And a quick thought as I sort of wrap up, that food is glorious. When we're talking about healthy and sustainable diets, it's easy to feel that this means our meals are going to be boring and virtuous and unappetizing. But healthy, sustainable meals can be really indulgent and delicious. Food is really interesting to everyone. It is a key part of our cultures. And here are some recipe photos from some of my favorite food writers who write predominantly vegetarian and vegan recipes. So that's Jack Monroe, Mira Soda, and Kate Taylor. And then just to conclude and wrap up, so reducing meat consumption, this is really important in high income and many medium income countries to combat climate change and improve human health. Placing vegetarian options first in some contexts can increase vegetarian sales by about 5 percentage points, but it's a bit unreliable as a method. However, doubling your provision and availability of vegetarian options, saw a 15 percentage point increase in vegetarian sales, which was effective across all groups of diners. And thank you to the catering managers and catering staff for carrying out all of these different experiments, and to my colleagues and supervisors for their guidance. My current fellowship is looking at health, sustainability and behaviour change around supermarket products in an online shopping context. So if you're interested in those areas, do get in touch. My email address and Twitter are on the slide. And thank you all very much for listening.
Thanks, Emma, for a very interesting talk. I think we've got time just for one really quick question because we're running slightly over time here. So actually following on what you just said about supermarkets as well, someone here has asked whether do you think an obligatory traffic light system on food packaging, which visually represents how sustainable a good food stuff is, would help change consumer habits in a supermarket? And saying the government has resisted this move strongly and it's hard to know why. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, labelling. It is interesting, and that is something that's been done around healthy labels. And I think it's perhaps a first step, but isn't necessarily enough. I think, for example, we all know we should be eating 5 portions of fruit and veg a day and not have too much sugar and fat. But it's really hard when you're in a food environment where unhealthy food, it's really easy, it's quite cheap, it's convenient. Healthy meals can be cheap, but they take quite a lot of effort to prepare. So I think information alone is not enough to change. And it's also, I would argue, a little unfair to expect people to just inform people and then expect everyone to sort of swim upstream and put in a lot of effort to try and make a healthy and sustainable decision. And so possibly labels might bring about knowledge that would have support for policy changes which would actually be effective, such as sort of pricing and availability and probably chef training and a number of other different things.
Great, thank you very much. And so we'll move on to our next speakers. There's actually 2 speakers. So we've got James Smith and Adam Twigg, who will be presenting a project together. So James, I think you're going to share your screen. And they will be speaking on understanding the opportunities of improving asthma care while reducing its carbon footprint. So over to you, James.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Great. So my name is James Smith. I work in the Department of Public Health and Primary Care, where I do a lot of teaching and I supervise student projects, which is one of the things we're going to present to you. Adam's going to present a project he's done to you today. Before we get into the details of the project, I wanted to give a little bit of an overview about why we're talking about respiratory care and asthma care particularly. And also just to say that part of the reason I'm doing this introduction is because I'm a practicing GP, and I wanted to start by just saying, please don't take this as medical advice for yourself. If you do, watch the presentation and you do use inhalers, please do think about talking to your own GP or nurse or respiratory consultant about this before making any changes. So that's just the obligatory safety announcement at the beginning. So why do we focus on respiratory care? So in respiratory care, we have inhalers that are used for asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And a large proportion of these are metered dose inhalers. So that's what this picture is of. So they have a little canister in them with a propellant gas in it, which helps the medicine squirt out into your airways, down into your lungs. And these propellant gases are hydrofluorocarbons. You can see on the slide there, I've put the 2 hydrofluorocarbons that are used in the UK in metered dose inhalers. And these are thousands of times worse than carbon footprint, in terms of carbon footprint than CO2. So that's their global warming potential there. And the reason this is important is because of this disproportionate carbon footprint. They estimate that the inhalers make up about 3 to 4% of the NHS's carbon footprint in England. And obviously that is a huge carbon footprint because of the size of the NHS, all the hospitals, all the GP services, all the products brought into the NHS. So that's 3 to 4% of a consumption carbon footprint, top-down consumption carbon footprint of the NHS. And if you're looking at the part of the NHS that I work in, which is general practice, it will be disproportionately even more because we don't have the big hospitals and the sort of high energy infrastructure that secondary care has. And then, so the other important thing to understand is that while metered dose inhalers have this very high carbon footprint, there are alternatives, and dry powder inhalers are the commonest alternatives. There's also a sort called soft mist inhalers. And for dry powder inhalers, the patients suck in the medicine, so they provide the energy for the medicine to come down into the lungs. And the metered dose inhalers range between about 10 times the carbon footprint to about 35 times if you're using the ones with HFA 227EA propellant. So I did some work with some other general practice colleagues on just producing a guide for GPs about what they could do to reduce the carbon footprint in their respiratory care, which is an online guide that we produced. And the first thing to say is that any efforts to improve respiratory care or that successfully improve respiratory care can potentially lower carbon footprint because you're avoiding high carbon hospitalizations. And you're also potentially reducing the use of the reliever inhalers. So that's the blue inhalers that you commonly see people with, which are a large proportion of the carbon footprint. And if you reduce the need for those reliever inhalers by having better preventative inhaler use, you can reduce the carbon footprint. So with the work with Adam that Adam's going to present, we didn't really think about the overall respiratory care because that's far too broad a subject. But we were thinking about these other 3 points. So we thought about the choice of inhaler. So that's whether you're using a dry powder inhaler or a metered dose inhaler. We thought about how if patients needed metered dose inhalers, because some patients won't have sufficient inspiratory flow to use a dry powder inhaler, what sort of dosing regime and what brands you were choosing. And we also looked at whether disposal was mentioned, because when metered dose inhalers are thrown away into landfill, the hydrofluorocarbons will go back into the atmosphere. However, if they're recycled or incinerated, the hydrofluorocarbons will can either be captured or chemically altered by incineration. So in understanding this problem, which is a really a current one at the moment in the NHS has committed to reducing its carbon footprint to 0 by 2040 for its direct emissions, and before 2050, I think it's 2048 or 46 for the consumption emissions. So it's ahead of the Climate Change Act in the UK. The NHS England, the central body in the NHS, is pushing on to try to move quicker on this. They've recognised that inhalers are a big part of this. And so the question is, how do you change inhaler prescribing behaviour? And I guess even before that, you have to ask, well, is it appropriate to change this? These are clinically important drugs. One place to go to this and say, well, what's the variation in this? And we know from other work, comparing the UK to abroad, that in the UK we use about 70% metered dose inhalers, whereas it's much less across the rest of Europe, with Sweden being at the other end of the spectrum, only about 13% of metered dose inhalers. But then when we look at variation within England, so this isn't our work, this is nationally available prescribing data, you can see there's a big variation within parts of England on inhaler use. So this graph shows the metered dose inhalers. They've taken out the reliever inhalers, so it's just the preventer inhalers. And they're comparing different clinical commissioning groups, so subsections of the NHS. Adam's going to explain what those are in a moment. With the dotted blue line across the middle, going across time with the percentage of these preventer inhalers that are metered dose inhalers. And you can see the red line at the top, so that's actually Cambridgeshire. So you can see that Cambridgeshire has a far higher percentage than the national median, and some areas of the northeast of England are much lower still. So you can see there's this big variation. So really we wanted to try to understand why was there this variation across England, really because we're looking for places where you might intervene to try and change the prescribing patterns of metered dose inhalers in the UK. So I'm going to hand over to Adam, who's going to talk about the work we did looking at guidelines across England.
Great, thanks, James. Can everyone hear me all right, just to check before I start?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So James was mentioning CCGs, which stand for clinical commissioning groups, and this colourful map on the left shows all of the clinical commissioning groups in the UK. There's 135 of them in England at the moment. There was more when we were doing our research, but slightly annoyingly, there was a big change in the grouping recently, so there's fewer now. But essentially, they oversee primary care within their regions, and they produce guidelines that everyone working in GP practices within that region will use when they decide what to prescribe for asthma. And unfortunately, I have to go into a little bit more background about the types of inhalers, which may be slightly less interesting, but just so it was clear for the for what we've done in this project. So on the right here is some national guidelines that's produced by the British Thoracic Society and the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network. And essentially, we were looking at 5 different classes of inhalers. So James talked about one, which was the reliever inhalers, and they're the blue ones. And these are, they contain a drug called short-acting beta agonists. So they'll be abbreviated as SABA inhalers, and they're used sort of as and when you need them if you're short of breath. And then there's 4 types of inhalers that you use as these long-term preventer inhalers. So one of these is low-dose inhaled corticosteroids, and that's sort of the lowest step of treatment. So someone coming in with a new diagnosis of asthma would be given one of this type of inhaler, and then if their symptoms aren't controlled, you would step up to a combination inhaler, which has a combination of this inhaled steroid and a type of drug called a long-acting beta agonist, which is abbreviated as LABA. And those can be low, medium, or high dose. So just to reiterate, the 5 types are these reliever inhalers with SABA, the low-dose ICS inhalers, and then the low, medium, and high-dose combination inhalers. So if you go on to the next slide, James. So we were looking at all of the CCGs on the map previously, and we were looking at all of the guidelines that they use locally and how they represent MDIs and DPIs as options for prescribers within those groups. Because obviously the graph James showed about Cambridgeshire compared to the rest of the UK showed there's a huge variation within the UK, when we wanted to see if that variation was also true in the guidelines. So this picture up here shows the Cambridge and Peterborough CCG guideline, and essentially they have all of the same steps that I was talking about before, and those steps are the class of device, and for each one they recommend a specific brand and type of inhaler. So that's the kind of detail that the CCG guidelines go into. So we collated through a sort of logical searching method that involved web searching, emailing these CCGs, and some freedom of information requests to get as many of these guidance documents we could, and tried to get a sort of representative section of the country. I think we managed to get 144 documents in total. That was, as I said, because there were more CCGs when we were doing this research. And meticulously through each of these guideline documents, we looked at for each class of inhaler, whether DPIs were available at all. So that's just a reminder, the dry powder inhalers, which are more environmentally friendly. And then not only if they were available at all, but if a prescriber could use them first line. And what we mean by that is if you had a new patient coming in, could you give them a dry powder inhaler, or would you have to try another one first? So just for an example, on the Cambridgeshire one, even though it does include dry powder inhalers, if you look along the very first row there, none of the first choice options are actually dry powder inhalers. So as a GP in Cambridgeshire, which James is, you would have to go against the guidance if you did want to give a patient a dry powder one. So we went through all of these documents and we recorded the following data if you want to go on to the next page. So once we looked through them all and obviously reached a consensus between the two of us, we were able to see how available these different types of inhalers were for each of the classes. So just to sort of explain this table, on the left you have the different classes of device, just if we're just looking at the first 5 rows. And on the right you have 2 columns. One is for these dry powder inhalers, the DPIs, and the other is for the metered dose ones, which contain the propellant James is talking about. So if we just look at the top row, so that shows the blue reliever inhalers, and it's talking about their availability first line rather. So it shows that in 77% of CCGs in England, these dry powder inhalers were available first line, whereas the metered dose inhalers were available in every CCG. And just to clarify, you can have multiple things available first line because some of these guidance documents said use this inhaler or this inhaler. And I don't want to get into the numbers too much, but essentially if you look at the left-hand column and the right-hand column, you can see just from the numbers in brackets, the MDIs are much more available across the board essentially. And the most marked difference is in these blue reliever inhalers and also the low-dose steroid inhalers. And that's quite significant because if you think back to that step diagram, they're sort of the lowest step of treatment and therefore are likely to be given to the most patients who will be on less severe treatment. So that means there's probably a disproportionate amount of metered dose inhalers being prescribed. And just at the very bottom 2 rows, if you collate all the steps, we saw that nearly all of the CCGs in England had an MDI available first line for every single class of inhaler, whereas only 74% had a DPI available for all of those steps. And maybe surprisingly or maybe worryingly, 10% of CCGs didn't have a DPI available first line at any step. So that's like Cambridgeshire. If you wanted to give any patient with asthma any type of inhaler, the first line recommendation from your CCG would be that it wasn't an MDI. Or sorry, it wasn't a DPI. Okay, you could go. Have we run out of time, Eric?
Yeah, we are running out of time. If you can maybe wrap up quickly, that would be great.
Yeah,
thanks.
Of course. So just as James said, there were some other environmental things we looked at. So surprisingly, 12% of CCGs actually come out with a statement that says we prefer MDIs, whereas only 3% recommend DPIs. And obviously that does go against the sort of NHS long-term plan and their commitment to reducing their carbon footprint. And then these particularly damaging inhalers are also quite widely prevalent, and these sort of damaging practices of having more puffs, so 2 puffs by daily, which is 4 puffs a day of a lower dose steroid inhaler rather than a higher dose, which obviously means more propellant per patient and more inhalers as well. And then just some very quick conclusions if we have 30 seconds or so. So essentially, we don't think the local asthma guidance is well aligned to this goal of reducing the carbon footprint of the NHS. And dry powder inhalers are overall much less available. But the good news is that minor alterations would be needed. So a lot of these guidances did have dry powder inhalers available, just not first lines. They wouldn't need huge sort of supply chain changes. They would just need small changes to the guidance. And we think those changes would improve clinical outcomes as well as the carbon footprint. But obviously we would need further work to understand the importance of different drivers for prescribing behaviour.
Great, thank you very much, both of you, James and Adam, for a very interesting talk. If there's anyone with a question, please ask your question now in the Q&A. We've not got much time, but I may just ask one quick question. I mean, this is obviously really, can have a really big change on the carbon footprint of the NHS. So how do you think your findings will feed through and into how quickly will this feed through, I guess, is my question, and to actually change the inhalers that people get advised to use?
So, Adam, is it okay if I take that and then you can come in if you want to? So I think so the greener NHS agenda, which the big announcement came last October about decarbonising, has really put a push behind this. There was already a national inhalers group looking at these issues. They've reformed that and sort of updated it, and I'm part of that group working with NHS England, advising them. The challenge is moving from national policy to the local level. So equally, I know Cambridgeshire CCG are aware of this problem. We drafted some guidance last summer, but it hasn't come into play because of coronavirus and all the other problems. So it's really hard to then make it into practice. And even once it's guidance, it doesn't mean all the local GPs follow it, because I know Adam said about availability, but it's also, you can still just prescribe what you think is best, so but I think things like financial incentives for GP contracts and stuff might come. They were meant to come in last financial year, but they put it on hold because of coronavirus.
Okay, right. I think we'll have to move on in the interest of time. But if anyone has any questions for James or Adam, please ask them in the Q&A, and then you can type an answer there. And so our next speaker is Sarah Nelson from the Department of Engineering, who will be speaking on the role of society in accelerating the net zero transition. So Sarah, please, can I ask you to share your slides?
Yeah.
And, yeah, we can see your slides.
And the slideshow view?
Yeah, that's perfect. Right, over to you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing for my PhD, where we're looking at historical changes to ask what the role of society is, and specifically what the role of individual behaviour changes are in accelerating the net zero transition. So this is work with my supervisor, Professor Julian Allwood. So the motivation for this work really comes from two sort of observations about the climate discourse. And the first observation is that technological solutions, this symposium session notwithstanding, I think it's fair to say that technological solutions to climate change tend to dominate the discourse about proposed net zero targets or pathways. And I've put up here a graph from the CCC's net zero report, which shows sort of how the CCC allocates its emissions reductions in its proposal to net zero. And you can see that, so technological solutions are in red and behaviour changes in green, and the blue is a mix of both. And I think it's, it's pretty clear that there's going to be a lot of solutions that come from pairing behaviour change with new technologies, but it is quite stark to note the massive discrepancy in mitigation, which is allocated to pure technological changes such as, CCS and hydrogen, to those where they're allocated to behaviour change, like vegetarianism. So that question, or that sort of observation, then begs the question of timelines, specifically in the context of 29 years to net zero now. And there's quite a big body of evidence about the lessons from historical transitions, and specifically in the energy technology sector, and what that means for sort of general observations about future durations of energy transitions. So I've got some examples up here of studies which have been done in the past, looking at the rollout of things like gas and coal and wind as well. And you can see there's quite broad variation in the estimations, and that the variation comes from how the authors define the sort of window of rollout of the new technologies. But by and large, the results are on the scale of, of decades. And in the first study, it's more than 100 years. And I think so, coupled with the observation that technological solutions kind of dominate the climate discourse, this was quite a worrying observation for us, just sort of looking forward to the rollout, the long promised rollout of things like CCS and so on. So we wanted to take the methodology that are used in these studies and apply it to both technological solutions and also, or technological transitions in the past, and also social transitions. There isn't a lot of research out there about how long sort of widespread behaviour change takes to percolate through society. And so we wanted to use the tools sort of established in that energy research literature and apply them to social transitions. So to do that, we picked these 12 transitions, and we looked in detail at each of them. The technological transitions, we sort of stuck with the traditional energy sector transitions since 1900s. And the social transitions, we picked 7 transitions which were kind of motivated by an upsurge of societal change, or societal concern, and resulted in large-scale behaviour change. So for each of these 12 transitions, we built really quite in-depth sort of timelines which combined the technological and social sort of events in that transition with national policy developments, and we picked the national sort of jurisdiction based on a country which is either a first mover or a particularly rapid mover in that transition. And we coupled that in-depth qualitative analysis with some data-driven measures of how the transition was actually propagating through the technological market or through the population. So based on the 12 timelines which we built in this in-depth kind of analysis review, we were able to develop these frameworks for technological and social transition. So these are sort of based on comparisons and observations across the 12 transitions. We're able to map the so the supply of the new technology, the development of the supply, and the development of the behaviour change to those developments in technology, policy, and social changes. And the crucial things about these frameworks is that they enabled us to sort of define a starting event, either a policy or technology or societal event, or a quantitative measure, which marked the beginning of each stage in the process. So that was important because it enabled us, for each of the 12 transitions, we could kind of map back from these frameworks and allocate a period for each stage, and ultimately a period for the whole duration for each of the 12 historical transitions that we were looking at. So these are the results from that analysis, and these graphs show on the left the technology transitions, and on the right the social transitions, and how long they took to sort of percolate through the market or through society. And just Oh, just also to note the blue, so the blue bars on the left are the results for Gross et al., which is one of the papers that we compared to a lot. But looking at our results in the red and kind of salmon-y colours, it's pretty clear just by eyeballing it that technological transitions seem to take quite a lot longer. But I'll put some numbers on it. So the first number that I want to put on it is the period between the sort of conception of the technological idea or the social behaviour change to the tipping point. And the tipping point is the year where things really started to get going for the transition, be that sort of rapid market adoption of the technology or rapid adoption of the behaviour. And in our examples, it tended to take about 4 decades longer for technologies than it did for behaviour changes to get to that rapid growth period. And then the second number is for the whole duration and the whole sort of transition period. And again, that's about 4 decades longer, just under 4 decades longer for technological changes. So moving on to sort of this is kind of a summary graph of our work, and the x-axis shows the delay until growth starts. So that's that period I showed on the previous graph, which said how long does it take to get from the conception of this idea or technology to the sort of rapid growth tipping point period. And then the linear growth rate, and that measures once it gets to that tipping point, you know, how fast can it actually penetrate the market or penetrate society and change social norms. And obviously, ideally, all the transitions would be up in that upper left-hand quadrant, but our results suggest that is not the case, and that social transitions do tend to be faster in both parameters. And this has some quite stark policy implications in the context of net zero. And the first is that social transitions can be relatively swift, especially when supported by sufficient policy intervention. For example, with ozone and leaded petrol, both of those transitions were kind of really driven by quite aggressive policy support in the US in these examples. And the second policy implication is that technologically driven, those purely technological solutions to climate change are unlikely to be rolled out in time to help achieve or contribute significantly to a 2050 net zero target. And I think these two observations are quite relevant in the context of that first graph that I showed with the sort of predominance of technology in the climate discourse. So the third observation, I haven't talked about this a lot, but the third policy implication comes from observations that we're able to make from those frameworks that I introduced earlier. And we found that historically there are certain points in transitions which provide either opportunities for change and others present vulnerabilities. And one of the vulnerabilities we noticed was that in that period, just before sort of a rapid adoption of technology or behaviour, is quite vulnerable to macroeconomic conditions. And in the context of the pandemic and the economic downturn, that's quite an interesting observation, because there's been quite a lot of talk about the green recovery and pumping money into all sorts of different technology, offshore wind and CCS, which is really important, but perhaps there's an opportunity also to direct some funding towards sort of social aspects, because people, when they're worrying about being sick or whether they're going to be furloughed, they might not have the cognitive sort of bandwidth to worry about the climate implications of their decisions. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to sort of sum up by returning to the main question I asked, which is, so what is the role of behaviour change in society? And I think our researchers sort of looks at lessons from history to suggest that there is a role for behaviour change in society, prompted by policy support to accelerate that transition to net zero. Thank you. That's it for now.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a really interesting talk, and thanks for sticking so well to time as well. I've got a question come in here from Hui, who's asking, when you make estimations of the transition, which models have you used for the prediction? Is it more top-down macroeconomic models, or is it bottom-up ones such as agent-based modeling? And when you consider technological transition versus behavioral change, have you considered behavioral side of taking up technologies to speed things up, etc., in terms of an integrated approach rather than completely separating the two for comparison? And that second part of the question was actually going to be my question as well. So,
okay, so thank you for the question. So we use as this sort of established methodology is we don't use models exactly. I mean, it's based on sort of historical evidence. So we use that data and defined our own sort of framework, like the framework that I showed on the slides. So it's not based on models. It's more based on sort of quantitative benchmarking, given the sort of data that we're able to collect on the transitions in the past. And the second half of the question was about integrate. Can you repeat that? Sorry, Eric.
It's about the integration of the two things. So rather than looking at the technological transition versus the behavioral change, how do you marry the two concepts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like I showed in that first slide, that the marrying those two concepts is going to have a really important role in decarbonisation. And so we didn't just sort of have a third category, which is both of those transitions joined together in our analysis, but I think that's definitely an area sort of for further research. Some of the transitions that we looked at, could be classed as joining technological solutions with behaviour change, such as, for example, ozone depleting substance. So there was a technological solution in the form of a substitute chemical. But we were specifically looking at changes which were kind of driven by societal concern. So we didn't necessarily cover those in particular.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question here from Charlie, who's saying fantastic talk and insights. The duration to transition aspects, does the positive outlier of ozone suggest that when the crisis is critical or desperate enough, change happens quicker?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And I'd say absolutely that's the case. For ozone in particular, I just mentioned that there was a substitute chemical sort of discovered, which was changed. But I do think that sort of crisis mode where governments have a kind of license to take more decisive action than previously. And I think that the coronavirus and the sort of decisive behavioural and interventions that have been that we've seen over the last year is another example of that kind of crisis license that the government has given. And yeah, I think that's absolutely a good observation.
Great, thank you. And then finally, a quick question here still from David Reiner, who's saying, you can see how smoking is a societal transition, but it's less clear in what sense ozone depleting substance is behavioural change, since this was a mandated phase out.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that it's a good question, and we classed ozone depleting substances as a behavioural transition because it was driven by a social concern. I think one of the starkest observations is that the products which had ozone depleting substances, which were consumer-based products, they went sort of the demand for them absolutely went off a cliff after some of the studies which were published showed their damaging effects, and then only after that period was the mandated phase out sort of implemented by governments. So it was kind of again, the societal concern gave governments a license to take that decisive action.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to have to stop at the Q&A there and move on to the next speaker, but thanks a lot for your really interesting talk.
Thank you.
So the next speaker for today is Christina Xiao from the MRC Epidemiology Unit. So Christina, over to you, and feel free to share your slides. Great, there we go.
Hi everyone, I'm Christina and I'm a PhD student with the Center for Diet and Activity Research at the MRC Epidemiology Unit. And today I'll be talking about my review on carrot and stick and combined population level interventions on modifying travel behavior. So for the past decades, many cities have been designing streets and policies which prioritize driving, and this has produced several negative externalities both for health and the climate. One of them is that driving is a sedentary activity and decreases opportunities for physical activity, which is associated with obesity. And as you can see in this figure, rates of obesity have continuously increased in many regions around the world for the past 50 years. In addition, vehicular emissions account for up to a fifth of all ambient air pollution, which has important consequences for not only environmental factors such as climate change, but also health. In fact, outdoor air pollution is among the top 10 largest contributors to global disease burden. One alternative to car use that would also improve population health is through active travel or any transportation that includes walking, cycling, and even public transportation, since there's part of the journey where one needs to walk or cycle to be able to reach a public transportation stop or station. Furthermore, building walking or cycling into daily routines or incorporating them as habitual behavior is a key way of promoting physical activity and improved health. Other benefits arise when replacing car trips with these more sustainable forms of transportation, as vehicular emissions can be reduced as well. However, given the diversity of policy options that decision makers can use to influence travel behavior, one critical question is, which one should we prioritize? And so this review sought to differentiate the effectiveness of interventions that had strategies that had a positive, negative, or combination of components. So an important part of my study was how to categorize the interventions as either carrot, stick, or as a combined intervention. And the carrot and stick framework has been used to compare the effectiveness of individual or combinations of health policies. In general, these studies define carrots as interventions that encourage or incentivize a desirable behavior, whereas sticks are defined as interventions that deter or punish an undesirable behavior. But we wanted to come up with a carrot and stick classification system that would apply to as many different interventions as possible. And so I thought I'd walk you through each step in the strategy, starting with the intervention description. I provided a few examples of different interventions here, ranging from a free bus pass to congestion charge to car-free centers. From the intervention description, we then deduced the function or how the intervention sought to change behavior. So for the free bus pass, this was reducing financial barriers to take public transit, while for congestion charges, it would increase financial barriers to drive. For car-free zones, that would be both an increased space for walking and cycling and decreased space for driving. Then we categorize these into gains or losses for those who could potentially be affected by the intervention. So gains were translated as carrots, losses as sticks, and interventions with both gains and losses are classified as carrot and stick interventions. We used the PICO framework to help specify our systematic search. So 9 databases were searched for controlled before and after studies of population level interventions and commuting related transportation outcomes. So this included driving, active travel, public transit, walking, and cycling. And the population that we examined were adults in the general population. After conducting the search according to the eligibility criteria, we identified more than 40,000 records, which was eventually reduced after multiple rounds of screening to 83 publications assessed in a systematic review. And from there, 62 studies were included for quantitative synthesis or meta-analysis. And here you can see how many interventions that we found, which fell within each carrot and stick categories. Most interventions that have been mentioned in the literature were carrots, and comparatively speaking, there have been few interventions with a stick component. We also found that the variety of interventions which sought to influence travel behavior to be quite diverse. So from 20 different intervention types, ranging from building new walking and cycling infrastructure to congestion charging, we were able to distinguish 8 different functions that are listed at the bottom of this graph. And this graph also presents the number of functions within each carrot and stick category. So most interventions, particularly those that involved a carrot component, had functions involving access, safety, space, and convenience, while stick-type interventions tended to target financial functions, which is represented by the maroon bar. And here's a depiction of interventions that have been introduced by different contexts at the country level, with the colors representing different continents, and the size of the circles corresponding to the number of interventions that were found in each country. So you can see here that most studies have been conducted in the US and Europe, with a lack of studies from lower middle income countries. I've also used a harvest plot here to visually organize the outcomes for each of the transportation modes and by care and stick category to be able to compare them. So studies were sorted into different outcome categories at the top, depending on whether the travel behavior decreased, did not change, or increased. And each row represents a different care and stick category. Here, the number of intervention components are labeled at the top of each bar, and taller bars represent higher study quality, which we assess using a quality assessment tool. Lastly, the shading of the bar indicates whether the behavior change was found to be significant in the evaluation. And here you can see that in the majority of studies, and for those of higher quality, interventions were associated with a decrease in driving. Carrot type in studies on the top row had more mixed findings, as seen in the number of bars in the no change column. As for studies which reported aggregated active travel outcomes, you can see that there are markedly fewer interventions with a stick component, but the ones that do all found an increase in active travel modes. Again, care intervention outcomes were more inconsistent than the other categories. And we also have plots for cycling, walking, and public transit as well, but they also follow a broadly similar pattern of mostly showing increases in these active travel behaviors, with much fewer stick interventions and more mixed care intervention results. So to get a sense of how the magnitude of effect sizes differed by care and stick category, presented here are the summary estimates for each forest plot by mode of transportation and care and stick category. You can see that for the most part, estimates were not statistically significant, though point estimates were greater for combined care and stick interventions than single carrot type interventions. For driving, stick interventions had the greatest effect, which makes sense because driving is a more proximal outcome for these types of interventions. So just to sum up the findings, this review found that most interventions evaluated in the literature were carrots and conducted in higher income countries. In general, results indicated a decrease in driving and increase in active travel modes. And interventions classified at carrots had less consistent findings, whereas interventions with sticks tended to have larger effect sizes than those with only carrots. This is the first review to compare whether positive, negative, or combined strategies differ in effectiveness for transportation choice. And further research is needed for interventions with stick strategies, which suggest stronger effects, yet remain less well studied. And this we hypothesize maybe because these types of interventions are either more difficult to introduce or implement due to issues regarding acceptability. Another reason we thought of was that stick interventions can be less conducive to experimental manipulation, since these interventions most likely happen outside the control of research. And this has implications for both research and policymaking to implement more stick interventions that are accompanied by care interventions. The rationale is that when restricting or discouraging one form of transportation, that you provide opportunities for the more desirable transportation mode. This way you can move from car-centered to people-centered cities and create more sustainable and healthier environments. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Christina, for a great talk. We've got time for a couple of quick questions. There's a question here from Kenza asking, do you know of any other successful stick interventions that have been used outside of transportation?
Yes, that's a great question. So there haven't really been many reviews looking or comparing these different types of interventions, but there have been single studies that have looked at smoking cessation and increasing physical activity, such as increasing step counts. And they compared whether offering a financial incentive was more effective, or compared that against the opposite, which was giving them a lump sum of money, which they could then lose if they didn't reach their target behavior. And they actually found that the stick interventions were more effective than the carrot intervention, which is aligned with my findings as well.
Right, thank you very much. And a quick question here still from Killian, who's asking how long lasting were the changes, like actually changing the habits affected by seasons potentially?
Oh, that's a great question as well. So these studies differed by the follow-up period. There are some that followed up to 11 years. In general, transportation studies try to follow up at least a year afterwards in order to account for those differences in seasonality. So you try to measure the behavior in the same season,
right?
If possible.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to have to move on to the next speaker, but thanks a lot for your talk and answering those questions. If anyone has any other questions for Christina, please ask them in the Q&A. And then we're on to our final talk of today, which is a team of 3 people, William, Moody, Ellie Fox and Emma Clarke, who will be speaking about using youth community-based resources to tackle the climate emergency within Cambridgeshire communities. So over to you guys, and I think Will is going to share his screen. And this is, my understanding is that these are the outcomes of a project from the Custody Policy Challenges. Yes, here we go.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks very much, Eric. Today I'm going to be talking along with Emma and Ellie on our project that we've been doing with Custody, which is using youth community-based resources to tackle the climate emergency within Cambridgeshire communities. And we've been working with Cambridgeshire County Council as part of our research. So why youth-based community networks? So when we looked at the Cambridgeshire County Council's climate change and environmental strategy, which is what they've been using to try and reach net zero, or consult to reach net zero in the county, we found that actually only 3 out of 371 respondents to their surveys were under the age of 24 years old, which you can see in the pie chart in the top right. Not only that, but also there was a massive uneven distribution in the different sectors of the county. So you can see in the pie chart at the bottom that Cambridge and South Cambridge are massively overrepresented compared to East Cambridge, Fenland and Huntingdonshire. Now, the council previously had similar issues with other parts of their strategy and engagement. So what they try to do is use community engagement strategies to overcome this disproportion. And the 2 kind of options that they've been using to great effect is the Community Land Trust, which has been used in Swaffenpire. And this is a method based on kind of forming a committee to try and come to some sort of community-based outcome. And a second is to do with community champions, which is more based on using individual networks to come to a decision. So our idea was, could we use these trust type or community champion type models to better engage with the young people across the county, specifically on climate issues? So this led to our project aims, which firstly was to understand the potential community engagement models that we could use. So that was the trust and champions that I just talked about. Secondly, look at how young people are currently engaging with the county on climate action. And then thirdly, to develop some policy recommendations for the county to engage with young people specifically. So the way we did this, just really quickly, our methods. Started with a literature review, looking at the managing community engagement through the commons, which is what I talked about with the land trust versus the champions. And then we also looked specifically at how to engage young people in climate issues. Using that literature review, we then used that to inform a focus group, which we did with a range of small groups of young people from across the county and across different areas of the county as well. So we had a youth council, a school and a youth organisation, and this was all done via Zoom last year. So then we used the results of that focus group to then produce a Cambridgeshire and Peterborough-wide survey. And not only did we ask for more questions or produce more questions to get more data on what young people have and opinions on climate issues, but we also gave the opportunity to suggest potential policy recommendations that we came up and kind of test the water as to how popular they might be. And I'll just hand over to Ellie now, who's going to talk more about the focus groups.
Thanks, Will. So yeah, for our focus groups, we sort of carried out 3 main activities. Firstly, we asked young people to sort of rank their climate and environmental priorities, and what came through here was that generally mitigation was higher ranked than either adaptation or natural capital responses. We also identified a bit of a knowledge gap on local issues in Cambridgeshire. So we saw that, for example, peatland restoration was consistently ranked quite low, even though it's very big in Cambridgeshire and is a really big store of carbon. We then looked at actions that young people can take and would like to take, and what the sort of enablers and barriers to these actions for climate change were in their day-to-day lives. And we found that people were already exhibiting quite a lot of eco-positive behaviours, so recycling, reusing, trying to reject fast fashion. But for some activities they wanted to take, such as moving more to a plant-based diet or cycling more, there were barriers, and these mainly were sort of cost, convenience, and also the fact that they live with their parents, so weren't necessarily the main household decision maker. Then in the focus groups, we explored a bit more the two engagement models that Will mentioned through a role play, so looking at sort of a network of individuals or more of a trust and committee. And what we found was that there wasn't a clear preference, sort of each group had their own preference, but there wasn't one versus the other overall. But this also showed the potential for maybe having a hybrid engagement model, taking what people saw to be the best bits of each model. And then other sort of principles for any further youth engagement that came out was that people found it was really important to have representation from across the county, because they recognised that what someone in Cambridge City wants might be different to someone's priorities for climate action from a rural area. They also suggested having a mixed funding base, so with some funding from the council being really important, but they didn't want to rely on that, and they thought that fundraising for themselves was an important thing to do, and also a way of building relationships with the wider community, which is our last point here. And that was a way really to raise awareness of climate issues sort of more widely than their small group, and also to ensure that sort of there was sustained engagement over time in their activities. And then we sort of water tested our findings in a survey, and we had over 640 responses of people aged 16 to 18 predominantly. And firstly, the survey findings really did support the themes that came out of our focus groups. So people, for example, felt less confident on their understanding of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough specific climate issues compared to a global understanding. But despite this, people really did see engagement and involvement at the community level as crucial to tackling the climate crisis. And then barriers to engagement, again, were sort of similar, so cost, convenience, and not being the principal household decision maker. And then lastly, we also looked at sort of how young people wanted to engage with the council going forward, and they really were keen for more engagement. They wanted to be communicated with online through sort of TikTok or Instagram, but also receive emails as sort of a more direct communication channel. And the content they wanted to see was information and tips, but also maybe sort of a bit bigger content like events and videos as well. Lastly then, for sort of further policy and climate action in the council, they really wanted there to be a dialogue, so through regular surveys and focus groups, a bit like we've done in this study, and also interaction through a network of schools. And I think Emma's now going to talk about our policy recommendations and conclusions.
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, so I'm going to draw out some of the main conclusions of our study, which then supported the policy recommendations that we developed for Cambridgeshire County Council that I'll detail in the last slide. In general, there's a big opportunity here if local government can engage young people in community climate action. Our study found that young people are both concerned about the climate emergency and are highly motivated to take action. Young people are embedded in community networks already, so there's a big potential here to harness those community networks and resources to tackle climate change. Our study tested among young people different models of community engagement, and while we found that no one model was preferred, we identified some key principles that must be present in any approach to community engagement. These were diverse representation, direct communication channels with local government, consistent financial support, and the importance of building wider relationships within the community. Our policy recommendations were also aimed at overcoming some of the barriers to youth local climate action that we identified, including cost, convenience, and lack of authority over household decisions. And in addition, we hope to provide some insights from our communication and engagement with young people while conducting this study for Cambridgeshire County Council, who currently don't have a specialized infrastructure in place to communicate with and to support young people on climate issues. So our main recommendation for Cambridgeshire County Council was to use a range of community engagement models to encourage and support youth climate change action within communities. we recommend setting up a youth environmental trust or committee in each Cambridgeshire district to support and further the work of networks of already engaged and passionate young people through council support and funding. Following from the community champions model, we also suggest setting up school eco-lead teachers or students, or more generally representatives from youth organizations who are designated to reach out to their communities. This model, we think, would increase the reach of the council and their engagement to both younger people and to less well-represented demographics and communities. We found that young people really prized the opportunity to engage in their communities and to be the ones reaching out to other young people. We propose, therefore, a few opportunities to facilitate young people's action, including running events centering on community action, creating a free council accredited educational course for young people to learn about local climate issues, about how to effectively communicate the climate crisis to peers, parents, or guardians. And we suggest that the council encourage work experience in local environmental issues as well. In addition to council consistent financial support for youth environmental committees and these champions, we also suggest the creation of dedicated grants available to young people engaging in local climate action. And finally, drawing again on our own experience engaging with Cambridgeshire youth, we recommend running regular focus groups and surveys with young people, ensuring adequate representation to better understand their priorities on climate action and to facilitate their engagement with local climate issues. In general, Cambridgeshire County Council could improve its communication with young people through an improved social media presence with content specifically tailored to young people. While of course these recommendations are specific to Cambridgeshire County Council, we hope our research findings might be helpfully applied in other local government contexts within the UK. So with that, I'll conclude. Will, Ellie, and I are only three of a larger research team, so thank you to them. Thank you to all those at Cambridgeshire County Council who supported us in this work, and of course to all the teachers and students and young people we interacted with as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for a really interesting talk. And I've got a question here, which from Carol Brayne, which has come up in the chat rather than the Q&A, but I'll just read it out, which is, could this kind of model be linked explicitly to health and well-being, a life course approach with them, the younger generations, influencing all the generations about their multiplier benefits, also for increasing society's pressure on those making decisions? So could it be explicitly linked to health and well-being, basically? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that point, Carol. I think that's a great point. We didn't explicitly consider health and well-being in our focus groups. We found that of the issues young people were concerned about, they were concerned about public or transport. Public transport was a big one that came up over and over again. Also sustainable food and local food, that one's maybe a little more linked to health and well-being. So yeah, it certainly would be interesting for us to consider how to integrate an approach that included health and well-being as well. I don't know if Will or Ellie want to add anything to my answer.
Yeah, so the transport, though, I think could be explicit, as we've heard, explicitly linked to health as well in terms of physical activity and better environment for everybody if everybody's walking or cycling.
Yeah, certainly, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of our recommendations was to try and improve the council dialogue. So this is definitely something that we can even bring up with the council in our next meeting with them and try and add it as a potential survey or a future focus group for them to be looking at. So yeah, thank you very much, Carol.
Great. And there's another comment here from Anna Barford, also suggesting that you should share these findings with the local government association, as other councils may also be interested in them. And I know we're running slightly over time here, but I'm keen to just do Charlie's question in the Q&A really quickly, who's saying that it seems like you've hit upon a very important point. There isn't the appropriate political infrastructure to instigate the structural changes needed. If you could get the City Council to do one thing only, what would it be? interested to know what you think is most important. And please give me a quick question as we need to round up. And any of the three of you would like to take that?
I'll start with that question, but I'd be interested to hear what Will and Ellie think as well. I think it would be to more explicitly seek out the views of young people from across the county. So maybe that's a slightly cheat answer, because that's what our policy recommendations are hoping to do. But it was very clear that, yeah, there was not an infrastructure in place to look for those views, and we found that young people want to be engaged with in a different way, and they're passionate about issues, but that some of those issues might be different from ones that the population as a whole is really engaged in.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Will?
definitely. I'd just say, in addition to that as well, I think the one thing that came out of the research so much was that young people, they're so passionate about these issues, but maybe they don't quite feel like they have the authority to talk to local government or even government. So I think really, like Emma said, valuing them and giving them the platform to express their views and really make a tangible difference, I think is something. I think that comes exactly through what Emma said, through not only funding, but also having the engagement infrastructure in place for them to do that.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we're running over time already. But I think we've had a very interesting discussion and a huge range of interesting talks today. And I would just like to thank all the speakers for their really great presentations. And it was really interesting to explore how all these different topics link together around public health, societal change, the role of young people, public messaging and support, etc. So I hope that this event will spark some new conversations and new connections between different groups and researchers across the university. Just very quickly, a few points here at the end, that we're doing another symposium next week on resources and production, which you're all very welcome to attend. And so please do join us for that. And we will be sharing the link for that with everyone. Please do also join our mailing list, which we'll also share the link for, and follow us on Twitter. And we will also share the recording for this session on our YouTube channel once Lee's press embargo is lifted. So that will also go out, and then everyone who couldn't attend today will be able to join us as well. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone again, and also thanks to Antoinette and Charlotte, who've been behind the screens here, making sure all the technical stuff works well. And thanks to all the speakers for your great presentations. And yeah, hope to see you all at our next symposium very soon. Thanks a lot and have a good evening. Bye.